Nice, I won coin. Alright, cool. Let's go. Draw, standby, main, all good, cool, yeah. Alright, okay, I'll start by activating Big Bungus Blast. Yeah, Big Bungus Blast. Oh, yeah, it's a normal spell. It says, if it is the first turn of the game, inflict 8,000 damage to your opponent's life points. You can only activate one Big Bungus Blast per turn. Oh, yeah, it also says you cannot attack the turn you activate this effect. Which, just keep that in mind in case it comes up. Yeah, it's pretty good. It's unsearchable, though, and it's only good going first, so I guess it doesn't see much play. Probably why you haven't heard of it, Anyway, you want first or second game 2? Welcome to One Bad Take, the series where we take an immensely unpopular opinion about Yu-Gi-Oh!, one considered completely indefensible, and attempt to defend it to our dying breath. Should we unlimit Shifter? Should we design every deck to zone lock like Kashtira? Is stun the best way to play Yu-Gi-Oh? Let's decide together. This is One Bad Take. Hey everyone, Kat here, and welcome back to One Bad Take. Now, we've had some pretty terrible takes here on the channel, and each week I think I'm going to come in with a new take and have no one agree with me, and yet, surely enough, y'all scurry to the comments section saying, actually, I think that's pretty reasonable. But this time, for sure, I think, we found the one to finally get me canceled on Twitter. And that is that FTKs, rather than being unresponsive, boring, and frustrating, are actually some of the most fun and fair strategies in Yu-Gi-Oh! I would start this segment by saying, for those unfamiliar with the concept of a first turn kill, but I actually think first turn kills are so integral to the history and game of Yu-Gi-Oh! That no one could possibly be unfamiliar with them. In fact, one of the most popular FTKs of all time is tied to the literal most iconic card in the series, Exodia. But whether you're trying to draw all 5 pieces of Exodia, burning your opponent for 8,000 damage turn 1, or milling your opponent out card by card, no one can deny that FTKs have been an integral part of Yu-Gi-Oh's history. But just because they're iconic and historic doesn't inherently mean that their gameplay is healthy or engaging, especially not for both players. But I also don't necessarily think that they're unhealthy either. The state of FTKs in Yu-Gi-Oh! Often leaves them being one of the more interesting things a player can attempt during a given format, and can legitimately end up being more interactive and more fun than a standard game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Before we continue, however, I wanted to make a quick clarification between FTKs and pseudo-FTKs. By this, I mean the effective difference between a deck that draws all 5 pieces of Exodia, and a deck that, say, sets up 8 Omni Negates for your 6-card hand, or one that hand loops you for 5 before passing turn with 1 Omni left for your draw. While I think in many cases FTKs and pseudo-FTKs accomplish the same thing, I do think there is a meaningful difference in how the decks feel to play against, and so think some arguments defending FTKs may not in fact apply to pseudo-FTKs. Your specific mileage may vary with respect to that distinction, and I may be splitting hairs here, but I wanted to get out of the way before jumping into the arguments. So, just to be clear, burning for 8,000, good. Omni negating 8 times, bad. Alright? Alright. This argument may seem emotive and completely baseless from any sort of grounding logic, but let me make my case. When considering what I want from Yu-Gi-Oh! As a game to play and as a spectacle to watch, a few things come to mind. One of them is that I want to be able to feel tension in a game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And I think FTKs are uniquely good at creating that feeling of tension. Or, well, maybe dread if you're sitting down across from it, but notably, something. When I see someone reveal Rotary and then normal summon Q turn 1, I understand conceptually that the game may already be over due to the M board being unoutable. And I find that experience frustrating. And oftentimes, I'm helpless to do anything about it. But when I see a draw spell into another draw spell and catch a glimpse of that Exodia leg, well, now my interest is piqued, even if the end result may ultimately be the same, i.e., I lose the game before I play a single card. That is to say, the way many FTKs are designed in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that they're designed to be inconsistent enough that they do not necessarily single-handedly win the game off of a single activation, which creates a more dynamic viewing experience than much of Yu-Gi-Oh's ultra-consistent game design. One of the most frustrating experiences as a viewer, and as a caster for competitive games, is seeing the same combo play out in the same way 100 times once the first card has been activated. And while, admittedly, some FTKs in Yu-Gi-Oh! Do accomplish that, there is, I believe, something very fun in getting to watch an inconsistent combo maybe burn you to death. Maybe get all 5 pieces of Exodia to hand. The reason for this, too, is that first-turn kills are often very readable. It is very clear to any viewer what a player is trying to do once those burn damage numbers start hitting, or once you see a piece of Exodia, or once cards start milling out of your opponent's deck. Viewers could be easily confused by trying to navigate the ways in which, say, Zaylin acts as a chain negate to remix, which creates a new chain pop or possibly a search before adding clip to... You get what I mean. Since one of Yu-Gi-Oh's largest problems as a spectator sport is readability, FTKs really bolster that aspect of viewership and give viewers something to cheer for, or against. One of the most hype moments of Yu-Gi-Oh! I've ever watched was Jeff Leonard's feature match, where the crowd kept cheering one more piece, as he searched for the final piece of Exodia. Some of the most hype moments I felt while playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Were the moments I thought I had lost only for the Exodia player to pass turn 1 card shy. One of the most hype moments of Yu-Gi-Oh! Ever put to screen was the first duel of the anime when we learned that Yugi's grandfather's deck contains no pathetic cards. So when I say it's peak, I don't just mean I like it, I mean the design of many of Yu-Gi-Oh's FTKs makes games with them more watchable, more engaging, more tense, and ultimately more fun. I touched on this a little bit before with the notion of readability, but I want to talk here more broadly about what FTKs actually do to the diversity of a game like Yu-Gi-Oh! That is to say, alternate win cons change fundamentally how the game is played in a way that I find to be particularly healthy for a game like Yu-Gi-Oh! Think back to Master Duel's past formats, specifically formats where Pearly or Lunalight or Tempai were huge pieces of the metagame. When building a deck, you were actively conscious of having outs for towers, of having a plan if you sniff out your opponents playing Tempai. There were clear active choices you could make and needed to make when participating in those formats at a high level. I think formats are most healthy and most skill testing when there are a wide berth of strategies a person needs to plan for in deck building. And FTKs, well-designed ones anyway, do provide just that. Say a fairly consistent burn FTK hits the format that does about 8,000 damage turn 1. How would deck building change? Which decks would become better, worse? Which non-engine techs could you consider that might give you a little bit of life points or prevent a little bit of damage? Where could you interrupt the deck and how? It gives a new layer of what do I need to be prepared for beyond the huge Omni-Negate boards, the towers, and blind second strategies in a way that, as I said before, is very readable. Both players are aware of what sort of FTK is happening from very early on in the combo. Even newer players who are less familiar with the game would more likely and more reasonably be able to engage with those kinds of strategies, and they can help mitigate a lot of the sameness of what it feels like to combo off or play into an established end board. While on the topic of diversity, it also lends credence to a lot of archetypes and mechanics that have sort of fallen by the wayside. I know a ton of players of all skill levels who would love to play a dedicated burn deck, but such a thing doesn't really exist viably in Yu-Gi-Oh! At the moment. That doesn't necessarily mean it has to be an FTK burn deck, but given how off-the-walls bonkers so much of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is, alt-win cons do need to be quick and powerful enough to contend with major strategies, and making them FTKs is one way to do that. At the start, I brought up a distinction between FTKs and pseudo-FTKs, and here I'd like to return to that distinction. How close does a combo have to come to automatically winning to be a pseudo-FTK? Is the Cool Tune board, after looking at your hand and choosing your top deck, plus all of their interruptions, a pseudo-FTK? Is 6 Omni-Negates? 5 Omnis? 4 and an Ash in hand? One of the things I see very few people discussing when conceptualizing Yu-Gi-Oh's FTKs is that if your opponent plays turn 1 uninterrupted anyway, and you aren't specifically on a board-breaking deck, most games will also end in a loss where decision-making was possibly close to irrelevant. With FTK decks, there is a distinct trade-off where there should be. A lack of going second power, a weakness to interruptions, and a clear end goal that allows your opponent to intuitively understand where and when interrupting is necessary. If I'm part of a duel where my decisions won't matter, then I think it's reasonable to not want to pretend the decisions will matter by playing out a foregone second turn. Or, at least I think I would have more fun getting FTK'd in some silly way. As usual, I'm going to keep the section brief and vaguely improvisational because I want to hear your well-thought-out rebuttals in the comments, but there are some things I want to address because I personally find them to be one of the more curious aspects of recent Konami design. So first point, you might say, FTKs are okay, but the recent design makes them too consistent and too uninteractable, a la the Gimmick Puppet Field spell, which ultimately I think is probably the most fair statement you could make regarding the subject. This, though, feeds into a larger point of FTKs are bad because they take Yu-Gi-Oh! From a game about interaction to an entirely one-sided game, and I want to argue against that point briefly. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a game where you can interact with your opponent on their turn. Turn 0 plays exist, hand traps exist, and so an FTK in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is conceptually a different beast than in other card games. The other thing I want to touch on is one strange dichotomy, which are two arguments that are opposite of each other, but both kind of individually arguable. So the first one is, FTKs are bad because they have no secondary game plan. So if they get interrupted, they end on nothing. And the second one is, FTKs are toxic because they can be played in decks that do other things. So if the FTK fails, you can just make a full Snake Eye end board instead. To the first point, I think that's how FTKs should work when working well. An all-in style deck that says either this will work or I will lose turn 2. It just seems to me intuitively how an FTK deck should function. To that second point, I don't think the problem in that case is with the FTK deck themselves, but with the engines surrounding them, which is ultimately the fault of many Yu-Gi-Oh! Archetypes just simply being able to do Cold Fusion. An FTK shouldn't feel like someone is performing Cold Fusion against you. It should feel like Yugi top decking the final piece of Exodia. And, oh my god, I can't believe you pulled it off moment, not part 23 of an alt-route yummy combo you decided to go for because you were uninterrupted. FTKs are watchable, they're tense, they're engaging. Even if the turn 2 player isn't playing the game, they still feel active and relevant to it, which is not the case even in many longer games of Yu-Gi-Oh! They're intuitive, they help with onboarding, they diversify formats, and their largest downside, non-interactivity in non-games, is a feature so broadly applicable to Yu-Gi-Oh! That I hesitate to call it a function of FTKs and not just a function of Yu-Gi-Oh! Itself. I, personally, I'm just waiting for one to appear that helps shape the metagame around it to such an extent that I have to tech Hanawada. Okay, so I know you're in the middle of comboing off, but this was my starting hand. And I've low-key been trying to find a way to tell you, but like I didn't want to interrupt you mid-combo, I didn't want to have to call the judge, I don't know, I thought it would be awkward, but yeah, so good game?